I'm
Uh-huh.
frankly very uncomfortable with the idea of buffer zone because this involves restrictions on Indian troops visiting patrolling points. They're patrolling earlier, and you know denying access to Indian graziers to pastures they were
Mhm.
using earlier. Uh, Minister has called it temporary and limited in nature, but we don't know how temporary and limited
Hmm.
this arrangement is. So
Yeah.
our objective has to be what the Chief Army Staff, General Dwivedi, has stated publicly, including a lecture he gave on 23rd October, that we want to go back to status quo of April 2020.
You're on the gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Hello and welcome. My guest for today is Ambassador Ashok Kantha. He was India's ambassador to China. He's a China specialist. He also headed the Institute of Chinese Studies for some time, um, uh, not too long ago. Ambassador Kantha, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you for inviting me.
So, there's a meeting of the special representatives, which is due to happen sometime fairly soon. And I'd like your assessment of the SR mechanism. You know, they've met 22 times in the past. I think the last meeting was in 2019. And from what I gather, not much may have been achieved in all these meetings. What is your sense and what is your assessment of this mechanism? Has it worked? Has it not?
Surya, as you mentioned, the last meeting was in 2019. There was a hiatus or interruption caused by Chinese misadventure or transgressions in eastern Ladakh.
Mhm.
Now, during the meeting at Kazan on 23rd October, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi agreed that the special representatives should meet again, and we expect this meeting to take place soon. Now, your question as to how I assess the progress made in this mechanism, SR mechanism. I have been involved, rather, I was involved with this mechanism right since its inception.
Mhm.
You'd recall that during Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to China in June 2003, uh,
Yeah.
it was decided to appoint special representatives to explore from the political perspective of the overall bilateral relationship the framework of a boundary settlement. I think what is important here is that both countries agreed that a legalistic approach which had hitherto been adopted in boundary negotiations will not work
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
both sides had their own narratives, their own divergent set of claims, evidence, and they will never succeed in persuading each other about their respective cases. So, idea emanating from Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit and his discussions with China leadership was that we should seek a political settlement which will factor in the actual state of border areas and accommodate vital interests of both sides. So this was a major, change in approach adopted by both sides. Now there have been, as you mentioned, 22 rounds of discussions, and the outcomes have been mixed. Uh, the primary outcome was, signing of the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for boundary
Yeah.
settlement. That was in April 2005 during Chinese Premier Wen Xiaobao's visit to India. I happened to be the lead negotiator from Indian side for this agreement. And we agreed on a set of parameters and principles which are rather useful. We agreed that there must be early settlement because that will advance basic interests of two countries, and early boundary settlement should be a strategic objective. And we also agreed that both sides will make meaningful and mutually acceptable adjustments to their respective position on the boundary question so as to arrive at a package settlement. So we are looking at package settlement covering
Okay.
all sectors of India-China boundary. Here, the important point I would like to note that the Chinese were insisting that we agree to make meaningful concessions or large concessions eastern sector, and they'll make corresponding concessions western sector. This we did not accept. In fact, we
Okay.
rejected. So we talk about adjustments in
Hmm.
respective positions, and we clarified that on our part this will involve major adjustments in western sector and not in eastern sector. Then we also agreed on certain very useful formulations like two sides shall safeguard due interests of their settled populations in the border areas. This was, in fact, the last uh, point on which we agreed during my discussions with then Director General Asia Department, Chinese Foreign Office, Sui Tiankai, who was later Vice Foreign Minister and Ambassador of China to USA. They were resisting it, but we made it clear that without this, there will be no agreement. Essentially, idea was to make it clear that we will not cede places like Tawang, uh, which has
Hmm.
population. Uh, so we got a good agreement coming out of Manchapa's visit in April 2005, and it envisaged a three-step process. First step uh, involved agreement on parameters and principles, which was completed at that
Yeah.
time. Then we had to move towards agreed framework for boundary settlement, and this will essentially involve, give and take. What kind of concessions we'll make from our side, and we made it clear this will be in Western sector, and what kinds of
Hmm.
concessions Chinese will make from their side. And once agreed framework had been finalized, we had to move towards the delineation and demarcation of boundary by civil and military officials and surveyors of two sides. Now we are stuck on the second step, which is agreed
Yeah.
framework.
Yeah.
Here, there has been no breakthrough since 2005 because of number of reasons. Chinese are making unrealistic demands. Some demands which we had rejected out of hand, like they would like us to see Tawang and some other
Hmm.
areas in Arunachal Pradesh, which you'll appreciate no government in India can do. And
Yeah.
those areas belong to us, and we are not going to concede those Chinese claims. Likewise, Chinese are not prepared to accommodate our vital interests and positions. And in fact, they're resigning from some of the commitments like, on settled population. They're
Hmm.
trying to renegotiate. And there's a larger context of boundary negotiations. We are very clear that it will be political settlement and the settlement must advance, vital interests, strategic interests for both countries.
Hmm.
Now, post 2008, gradually Chinese have adopted a more revanchist approach, where especially under Xi Jinping, they take the position that they can't cede an inch of territory. If they can't cede an inch of territory, and if they demand areas like Tawang, clearly, it's unreasonable position.
Yeah.
And they have started, privileging sovereignty as nationalism becomes a major preoccupation in China. And they
Hmm.
also believe that given gap, an increasing gap in comprehensive nationalist strength of India and China, so they're not inclined to move towards early settlement. In fact, they're using unsettled boundary and some differences on line of actual control as pressure points in India-China relations. So therefore, my assessment is that prospects for early movement on the boundary question are not particularly bright.
So, would you say that the Chinese were sincere about a settlement before Xi Jinping, or was the
I will not
change?
say that. In fact, uh, 2005, when we were negotiating agreement on political parameters and guiding principles, they showed a fair amount of flexibility. That's why
Mhm.
we could get an agreement. There was desire on their side to, arrive at that understanding. But soon after that, they resurrected the language of what they call Changnan, South Tibet, to describe
Mhm.
Arunachal Pradesh. So they started, in subsequent discussions. Then, Chinese special representative Taiping Go, he started asking for areas like Tawang, which as I mentioned earlier, we cannot possibly cede. So I was involved,
Mhm.
in fact, in first 9 rounds of SR talks from 2003 until early 2007, and subsequently in 2014 and 15 when I was ambassador in Beijing. And one could see that progressive hardening of this position. Uh,
Mhm.
as I mentioned, uh, they became more sort of assertive of their territorial claims in different
Mhm.
theaters, whether it be India-China borders or South China Sea or East China Sea or
All
Taiwan
across.
Strait, particularly after global financial crisis of 2008-9. And this trend became even stronger after Xi Jinping uh, became the supreme leader of China in October 2012.
So things don't look very good.
Well, on the boundary question, yes, I don't expect early breakthrough. We
Any
have
breakthrough?
to keep discussing, but there is a huge gap between positions of two sides. We have consistently maintained that the settlement has to be realistic. And if you ask my personal view, it has to be largely on the basis of what Chinese had themselves proposed. During Chou Enlai's visit to India in
Yeah.
1960 and subsequently in 1979, when then Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee met with Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping had suggested that China will make concession eastern sector, and that India should make concessions in western sector, and that within this larger set of concessions there can be minor adjustments. Uh, this position
Adjustments.
was in fact reiterated by him subsequently, including an interview he gave to Vikrant magazine in 1980. So it's in public domain, but they have
Mhm.
gone back on it. Now they are demanding big concessions by India in the eastern sector. As long as they're doing that, clearly they're not interested in early boundary settlement.
So let's come to the recent disengagement accord, which the EM has been talking about in Parliament and outside. You appear to have some skepticism about that. You mentioned about access to patrolling points in the Depsang Plains and Demchok. What are your doubts here? Buffer areas. You mentioned that you've written about it. What are your doubts
Yes,
here?
I've written about it. Uh, what happened in summer of 2020 uh, is that China had amassed a large body of troops for what we initially interpreted as a routine military exercise.
Yeah.
Uh, but taking advantage of a distraction caused by the COVID pandemic, they pivoted and transgressed at multiple locations across the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. They also had some, uh, transgressions in Sikkim, for instance, but they did change the status quo in eastern Ladakh. And this was quite significant. It was not a minor change.
Mhm.
Then, as you are aware, there was a clash resulting in loss of life on the night of 15-16 June 2020 in the Galwan Valley, which was the first such incident resulting in casualty on either side since
Yeah.
1975, when we had a clash in Tulungla in eastern sector. Uh, there have been, phased disengagement. The latest being what was announced on 21st October, involving Depsang Plains and Demchok. The problem is that we are not very clear about details of a disengagement package. We have stated that disengagement has been completed, but what it involves is not fully clear. Uh, External Affairs Minister has stated in Parliament, including yesterday, that in Depsang Plains, we are resuming patrolling to patrolling points visiting earlier. That's a very positive clarification by him. It's not yet clear whether in Demchok we'll be visiting, places like you have Charding Nalla, which is a difficult
Yeah. Yeah.
place, but our troops are visiting, or junction between Nelung Nala and Charding Nalla, what is called CNN junction. It's
Mhm.
not clear if we are visiting that, but my greater concerns relate to what Minister referred to as steps of a temporary and limited nature in his
Mhm.
statements in Lok Sabha on 3rd December and Rajya Sabha on 4th December. This is a euphemism for what is being described as buffer zones. I'm
Uh-huh.
frankly very uncomfortable with the idea of buffer zone
Mhm.
because this involves restrictions on Indian troops visiting patrolling points. They're patrolling earlier, and you know denying access to Indian graziers to pastures they were
Mhm.
using earlier. Uh, Minister has called it temporary and limited in nature, but we don't know how temporary and limited
Hmm.
this arrangement is. So
Yeah.
our objective has to be what the Chief Army Staff, General Dwivedi, has stated publicly, including a lecture he gave on 23rd October, that we want to go back to status quo of April 2020. That
Mhm.
should be our objective. That these temporary measures should remain temporary. They should not become long-term in nature. If that happens, Chinese would have succeeded in their objective of materially changing facts on the ground to their
Mhm.
advantage. And in fact,
Mhm.
that is the Chinese approach in various theaters where they have contested territorial claims, through so-called salami slicing or gray zone
Hmm.
operations. They seek to make incremental gains while staying under the threshold of outright military conflict. If
Mhm.
they do that in Eastern Ladakh, or there are some media reports suggesting that they have received patrolling rights in Yangtze and Subansiri Valley in Arunachal Pradesh. There's no clarification from government on that. Yangtze, you would recall, Chinese have been trying to access repeatedly.
Yeah.
There
Mhm.
was a major attempt made in December 2022, which was foiled by Indian troops. We are well entrenched in this area, and allowing Chinese any patrolling rights, frankly, will be not to an advantage at all. So, if we have not made such concessions as quid pro quo, there must be authoritative denial coming from government of India. So, bottom line is that we must, restore status quo as of April 2020, as the army chief uh, being has been suggesting, in terms of both patrolling by Indian troops and grazing activities of Indian graziers.
These buffer zones, are they in our territory? Is it something that we have?
See, largely, that's the problem. There's lack of transparency. There's
Mhm.
absence of visibility on nature of these so-called steps of temporary limited nature. But
Mhm.
talking to people who are familiar with this area, and I also have some, familiarity with this area because I was a border negotiator from Indian side for close to 10 years. Now, most of these buffer zones appear to be on our side of line of actual control.
Mhm.
There are some pockets where there are overlapping, perceptions of line of actual control, but we naturally go by our perception line of actual control. Uh, so we were visiting places which we are unable to visit now. So that's a
Mhm.
change, material change, which has occurred since April 2020, and that should not be acceptable to us.
So, to be fair, this is not the first government which has kept a kind of shroud of secrecy over these dealings with China. Previous governments also have been very, very careful about not saying too much about the border and what's happening there. Although we get all kinds of reports coming in from Ladakh and other places about graziers being denied access to traditional grazing grounds, army PLA intrusions into various areas. This is something which has been going on for many, many years, isn't it?
Well, Surya, uh, I will argue that India has done a good job of protecting its territorial rights. In terms of line of actual control. During the period 1959-62, culminating in border conflict with China, we did lose territory. There's no doubt about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Primarily in the western sector, where Chinese are in illegal occupation of close to 38,000 square kilometers of Indian
Yeah.
territory. Plus, under the so-called boundary agreement between Pakistan and China,
Shakra.
Pakistan has ceded Indian territory
Mm.
to China and Ashok Valley. With exception of those, territorial losses, I think since 62, we have, by and large, been able to preserve territory uh, which belongs to India. Uh, in fact, way back in 1967, China tried to disturb the status quo in Nathula and
Yeah.
Chola in Sikkim sector, and we managed to push them back. In fact, Chinese suffered much greater number of casualties in those clashes. Uh, Subsequently, we have ensured that we are in effective control of area on our side of international boundary in eastern sector. There, a problem is that Chinese also agree that the line of actual control is as per what they call illegal McMahon line. But
Mhm.
we do not interpret McMahon line the same way. They interpret it literally as per, maps of 1914, whereas we go by highest watershed principle, which was the underlying principle behind boundary alignment worked out in 1914. So we have in fact managed to ensure effective control up to the watershed. There are a couple of pockets where Chinese are in adverse position. One is in Sumdrongchu Namkhachu Valley,
Yeah.
and one is in Longju, which has been there for some time. But otherwise, we have ensured effective control. In fact, we have not lost any territory. In middle sector, again, we are in control, effective control of the entire area that belongs to us as per our perception international boundary. Same is
Mhm.
true of Sikkim sector. There again, there are transgressions by China, especially in what is called fingers area, one particular area, but we have managed to ensure that they don't seize any of the area. In Western sector, they have been more active.
Mm-hmm.
They, as you're aware, tried to change the status quo in Depsang Plains in 2013 and in Demchok and Chumar in 2014. But
Yeah.
in both cases, we managed to ensure restoration status quo ante. In fact, I was the negotiator. I was cast to negotiate disengagement in Demchok and Chumar in 2014, and the mandate given to me was very simple: restoration status quo ante as of 1st September 2014, and we
Mm-hmm.
didn't discuss anything else, and we achieved that through a written agreement. In fact, uh, this time around, uh, extent of transgression has been more extensive, and
Mm-hmm.
Chinese are far less inclined to restore status quo ante as they did in the past. So that's why the importance of denying any gains to them through salami slicing, because
Mm-hmm.
that will materially change facts on
Yeah.
the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that's why I've been arguing that uh, we must show patience, and we should keep negotiating. I'm happy to note that when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi met in Kazan, they tasked special representatives not only to discuss the boundary question, but also oversee maintenance of peace and tranquility in border
Mm-hmm.
areas. This was not originally part of their mandate, but uh, I think NSA, who is our special representative, I'm sure he will keep pushing the Chinese side to see that they sort of restore status quo ante. So it may not be easy; it may take time, but we should show patience, strategic patience here, because otherwise, essentially, we lose territory.
Mm-hmm.
Because today Chinese are defining LAC in terms of sovereignty, which
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
when we agreed to construct of line of actual control, when we concluded the agreement on border peace and tranquility in September 1993, it is stated clearly that it's without prejudice to respective positions, the boundary question, and that caveat has been inserted in subsequent agreements as well. But today, even when it comes to LAC, Chinese are taking a very hardline position, not an inch or
Yeah.
two ceded. So I don't think we should lower the bar and agree
Hmm.
to any agreement, any understanding which will involve loss of territory. So what is seen to be limited and temporary steps should not become permanent. And likewise
Mm-hmm.
in Depsang Plains and Demchok, also we must ensure that there's restoration of patrolling by Indian troops and restoration of grazing by Indian graziers. Uh, Besides, as I mentioned earlier, if we have not made any concessions to Chinese side in terms of patrolling in Yangtze Valley, Yangtze area, or in Subansiri Valley, I think that should be authoritatively denied, because that's an important, issue for us, matter of
Mm-hmm.
concern to us. As I mentioned earlier, we have, in fact, since 62, ensured that there's no loss of territory in Arunachal Pradesh, with the exception of a couple of pockets which are under adverse possession of China. That should not change. One more point I would like to make, with regard to mechanism of special representatives. Since I have been involved with 11 out of 22 meetings. While the primary mandate given to special representatives is to seek an early boundary settlement, which will be a political settlement. They have also utilized this forum to hold strategic consultations, which is extremely valuable because
Mm-hmm.
especially given the fact that uh, uh, today worldviews of India and China are quite divergent.
Yeah.
We have suspicions about each other's strategic intent. Chinese tend to look at the relations with India through lens of their strategic
Yes. Yeah.
rivalry. USA, I think, need to have uh, frank and honest dialogue, so that while we cannot, it's unlikely that we'll be able to go back to a situation where we had a fairly extensive collaboration on different issues, bilateral, multilateral, and global. But at least we can make the relationship less confrontational
Yeah.
and keep exploring areas where we can collaborate without, of course, compromising our national interests.
Would you say, I mean, this is my last question, would you say settlement on the border would have been easier if Xi Jinping was not around, or
Uh, no, actually, even before Xi Jinping came to office as General Secretary of the Communist Party of China in October 2012, but we had seen hardening of Chinese
yeah.
position even before that. So since he became the supreme leader of China, nationalism has become a greater preoccupation. And in
Yeah.
fact, he has stated time and again that we will not cede an inch of territory. If you don't cede an inch of territory, then how do you arrive at
Yeah.
any kind of negotiated settlement? The whole approach that we had worked out in the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles of April 2005 was predicated on both sides showing adjustments,
Yeah.
concessions,
Yeah.
flexibility. Uh, we are willing to do that in Western sector in the expectation that Chinese will accommodate our interests, our position in the eastern sector. And we expected that any final settlement will essentially maintain the present position in the middle sector and Sikkim sector. But that approach, which Chinese were willing to accept by and large earlier, they have sort of
Moved away
changed
from.
their position, and so finding common ground uh, for a negotiated political settlement is far more difficult now.
And would you say we're able to read them well? Do we Are we able to anticipate, how
Uh,
they move?
we actually, uh, if one can claim that, we have not really been caught by surprise.
I
One
see.
occasion when we were taken by surprise was way back in 1985, when Chinese completely reinterpreted the package proposal. Until then, the package proposal was, as I mentioned earlier, predicated on uh, China accepting our position in eastern sector, India accommodating China's interests and position in the western sector, and that was stated publicly by Deng Xiaoping and conveyed privately to then Foreign Minister Narasimha Rao, and subsequently, when Mr. G. Parsarthi had visited China, I was present at that time. Uh, but that they changed that position in 1985. They started taking the position what they call Tung Thiao Shirang. That means India must make adjustments in the eastern sector and will make corresponding concessions western sector. So they just put the package proposal upside down. So we were, I was present in that meeting. We were a little surprised. That was way back in 1985. Since then, I don't think we have uh, really been uh, caught by surprise in boundary negotiations with China. What happened in summer of 2020? No, I was not part of government, so
Yeah.
I don't have access to full facts. But perhaps there was a misreading of China's intent. You know, ordinarily when Chinese hold these large exercises, understanding is that the strategic direction will not be towards us. And
Hmm.
likewise, when we hold exercises, strategic direction should not be towards China. This is understanding between two sides. We possibly didn't anticipate that they will pivot and transgress at
Hmm.
multiple locations. It was partly because of preoccupation and distraction caused by the COVID pandemic, but we were taken by surprise. That's why initially Chinese could move in on our side of the line of actual control, but our response was very forceful.
Yeah.
We managed to uh, ensure counter deployment in very quick time. That prevented any further transgressions on our side by the Chinese. And we have shown uh, the willpower to stay put. This is the fifth winter season when troops of two sides are
Yeah.
deployed in large numbers in very difficult
Yeah.
circumstances
Yeah.
at
Absolutely.
high altitude. But this is something perhaps we'll have to continue. De escalation and de induction is not going to be easy at all. As Minister Jaishankar mentioned in Parliament, we have to start, discussing, de escalation of troops and management of border.
Yeah.
But there is a fundamental problem there. When you look at the nature of terrain and border infrastructure, we are at a disadvantage.
Hmm.
And this we had anticipated. So when we were negotiating agreement on confidence building measures in military field, uh, which was concluded in November 1996 during President Jiang Zemin's visit, I happened to be main negotiator for that agreement. We insisted on a provision, which is Article 3.3 of that agreement, that any ceiling on deployment will take into account nature of terrain, border infrastructure, and time taken to induct and de-induct
Hmm.
troops. Because
Okay.
if we de-induct from both sides equally, they can move back much
Absolutely.
faster than we can. So we have
Yeah.
to factor that in. So it's not going to be easy, and especially given the fact that, as Army Chief has mentioned repeatedly, there is a very serious deficit of trust.
Yeah,
If you
absolutely.
deficit trust, you have to ensure that what they did in summer of 2020 is not repeated.
Not
So
repeated.
I don't think we'll be in a hurry to de-induct troops from those areas, and even de-escalation will be done after very careful consideration. I have no doubt about it.
Ambassador, fascinating. I wish we could go on, but we are completely out of time. Thank you very much for this explanation and the clarifications. A lot of questions still out there, and I think for our lay audience, it was very interesting to hear some of the comments you made. Thank you very much, sir. Looking forward to more such conversations in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Surya. Thank you for inviting me.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good night.